So this is, we're finishing up the vocabulary today. We're going to talk about the word hypothesis. So what I want you all to do right now is write down on your paper what you think hypothesis is. And most of you have a definition in mind for this because we've been using this word with you since you were in the 5th grade in science. And you've probably learned the same thing, and I can probably predict what about 75% of you are going to write. So I'll go ahead and let you write it, and then I'll come spy on you. I would say about the percentage that I would have predicted have the word guess somewhere on there. And a lot of you have educated guess, or that's what you were going for. Because we have taught you since, what grade do you think? Forever ago. You know, 1 billion years ago. 2nd grade science, someplace, 3rd, 4th, 5th. A hypothesis is an educated guess. I hate that definition of hypothesis. It works really well for little kids, but you're not little kids anymore. It's a good way to get little kids to wrap their brain around the idea of what a hypothesis is. But you know what, folks? You had understandings of how the world worked when you were 10, and you have a better understanding that's more complicated and truer now. And we're going to try to do the same thing with hypothesis. So we can do a better job defining this for you now because you're older. You're ready for it. So you can kind of mentally take that educated guess and set it aside a little bit. So I'll do that on the screen here. So we'll take educated guess and we'll kind of shrink it because we can do better than that now. It worked for a while. So what is a hypothesis then? It involves education, it involves information. It's not a blind guess, but it's not really a guess either. It's an explanation that we're still working on. Okay? A hypothesis is it's a work in progress. It's an explanation we're still working on. So let's actually go with that definition for right now. A working explanation. And I'll write that on the board. The base of thinking about things scientifically, honestly, is asking a lot of questions. So let's go back to some of the other things we talked about first. Being observant. Observing things about the world around you. So who had any observations this morning on the way to school? Anything interesting? Okay. Well, I'll tell you what. That fog was pretty dense, huh? So I drive quite a ways, and when I started out at home, I'm listening to a Pittsburgh radio station, and sometimes West Virginia. And then about halfway here, I switched to a Youngstown radio station. Because I lose the one station, it gets all crackly, and I switch when I pick up the other one. And this morning, I couldn't pick up anything. The Pittsburgh station was going in and out, and I was getting some other station on top of it, and then the West Virginia station didn't come in at all, and it wasn't until I got really pretty close here that I was able to pick up Youngstown. So it was like in and out, and, you know, what a mess. I didn't hear the news this morning. I'm bummed. And that's not usually what happens. So if you were in that position, would that make you wonder anything? Well, I thought, does this have something to do with the fog? Is the fog affecting my radio reception? I went through a whole thought process in my mind and decided, yes, it was. When you observe something, you have to ask questions about it. So let's go through sort of a scenario here that works us up to the idea of a hypothesis. And you'll want to write this down. If you're keeping a separate sheet for notes, that's fine. If you're putting them in with your vocabulary, that's okay too, but you will want to write these things down. To take in information with your senses, that could be watching, that could be what else? It could be smelling, it could be listening, it could be touching, tasting. So, all of you had observations about this morning. You noticed that the smell was different. I noticed that I wasn't hearing the radio the way I usually do. Many of you may have noticed that the headlights on whatever vehicle you were in, form a blinding wall of white ahead of you if you turn your high beams on. Well, let's think about something we could observe, a living thing, that we could kind of walk through this process on. Have any of you ever seen, and I will clarify this, even a picture of an albino deer? Really cool. Have any of you seen an albino deer up close and personal? Okay. Was it in the wild or at like a deer farm?
In the wild.
Okay. You're a lucky man.
By the river.
Okay. Lucky man. So let's say that recently we've seen quite a few albino deer. So an unusual number. If suddenly you're seeing albino deer, like maybe every day, you're seeing one hit on the road, you're seeing them crossing in front of you, you're seeing them in the field near your house, would you start to ask some questions?
Yeah.
What would you ask?
I want to ask why they're growing.
That's the big question, is why? Why are there suddenly albino deer? I mean, they're awesome, they're beautiful, they're cool, I would love it.
Yeah, weird noses.
Why? Oops. So, once we have some observations, especially ones that are a little bit out of the ordinary, we question. Question everything. Little kids are good at this, and we stamp it right out of you. Stop asking so many questions. Ask more questions. Really. So anytime we have observations that are kind of unusual, we want to ask. So we start to ask questions. How do you answer a question?
The statement.
Pardon? Well, yeah, in the simplest, but what if you don't have enough information? Well, what if there's no place to look it up? You're the one you're in uncharted water here. You're the one who's observed this thing. You're the one who's asking a question. There may not be somebody who knows an answer. But there might be. You only know if you gather information. So it might be asking. If it were me, I still have some old friends at Division of Wildlife, and I'd probably email somebody and say, hey, I noticed this. What do you know? Give me all the information you've got. Why is this happening? But, if Division of Wildlife doesn't know, if the game warden doesn't know, if nobody knows, what kind of information would be useful to help answer this question? And if we're gathering information, what do we call scientific information? Data. Which starts to get us to maybe like population size. How many of these albino deer are there actually? Have I actually just been seeing the same one all over the place? Is this like a fast-moving deer? So how many? Which really ties into both your questions. Birth rate.
How many sightings?
How many sightings? Yeah. So how many deer are there actually? What other information might you want to gather to help answer this question? Huh? Where are they showing up? You could have a map with pinpoints. There was actually a project a number of years ago, I think it's called Whitetail Watch, and it was a biologist who just happened to be really interested in deer. He loved deer. He thought they were really cool. And what he pointed out was, at this point in the U.S., in North America, we live with a lot of deer. I mean, there are a lot of deer in places like Ohio and Pennsylvania and Indiana and West Virginia. Deer have done really well. We've changed the landscape in ways that work really well for deer. He said, we're living, there are urban deer. There are deer that live in the city of Cleveland. There are deer in downtown Pittsburgh. There are deer in every suburb in America. There are a lot of things we don't know about them. Like, we don't have a lot of direct observations of them. What But we're interested in wild deer. So, we might want to know how many. We want to know where. Project Whitetail Watch, they took volunteers. So, Thomas decides he'd really like to lay in a tree platform for 10 hours a week. This is his idea of fun on a Saturday, and take good notes and just watch deer. And they collected that kind of volunteer data. So somebody said, hey, I can go out 2 hours a day in the evening. I'm going to lay in a tree blind and I'm going to just watch. And I will make notes. And they took data. Because where deer go and what they do when we're not watching, we don't really know. So, where are they? How many are there? Yeah, so how many is quantitative data, because it's got numbers. What about where they are? What kind of data is that? Qualitative.
Is that how you say it?
Qualitative, yeah. So there's quantitative and qualitative.
Okay.
So quantitative has numbers, qualitative describes. What else could we get information on? What other kind of data could we... I know one question I would have. Are they all related?
I feel like they would be.
It's a great question. Somebody in the other class, because we talked about the same thing, said, well, I'd like to know how old they are. Are they all old? Are they all young? Is this a bunch of yearlings? Are they males? Are they females? So they wanted to collect that kind of data, which means we're going to have somebody out there with a sedative dart gun laying in that tree blind, darting deer. And then when they pass out, weighing them, measuring them. If you're doing all that, you might as well take a blood sample. So are they related? What kind of data would that be? Are they related? It's a yes or no. Are there numbers involved? No. So what kind of data is it? Qualitative, right. So once we have enough data, we start to explain. Okay? So the word I'm going to write, Jade, why don't you move up to the center front? I know, it's still...
I still can't see it from there, but I'll move up there.
Okay.
It might work.
We start to come up with an explanation at this point. And that explanation is not perfect yet. It's not the best explanation we're going to get. So it's a working explanation. It's going to change. Hypotheses usually do change. So this is where you start to make a hypothesis. So maybe you have said, well, my suspicion is that we had 2 albino parents who produced a series of litters together.
Can I have your attention?
So, probably not. You're saying, well, this is how I think it's happening. This is how I think it works. That's your hypothesis. That's your working explanation. You're not done collecting data, because once you have a working explanation, you continue to test that explanation. Okay? So, once you have a hypothesis, let me pause. Once you have a hypothesis, you have to test it. So, in order to test it, how do you test it? Well, can you really experiment? You can't experiment in every single situation. So especially in biology, some things, it's not so much experiment as study.
Then how do you...
Well, that's a great question. That's fantastic. That's exactly the question I want you to ask.
Why?
In some cases, we experiment to test a hypothesis. In others, we're collecting more data, and it's sort of the experiment is running itself. So let's say we want to test the hypothesis that all of these albino deer that we're seeing are related, that they're all the offspring of one buck and one doe. They're all siblings. So can we figure that out? Yeah. Maybe.
Good enough, get a blood test.
I was going to say, you ever watched, what is it, Maury Povich, Who's the Daddy? You can do Who's the Daddy with deer. If you can tag them, you can get a blood sample, you can play Who's the Daddy. And you can figure out if you can get enough of those albino deer and get samples from them, even if you never actually meet the daddy. You can tell if two people or two deer or two turtles or two fish are closely enough related that they share two parents. So once we have a hypothesis, we have to find a way to test it. And we will talk a little bit more about testing hypotheses on Monday. I have a favor to ask you. Well, we'll stop the recording.